So now that we've had a discussion of what you guys think were the reasons that the Cold War emerged after World War II, I will give you my take. And there are a number of factors involved. Like most things in history, it's a little bit complicated. And we're going to start with geography. Because the geography of the two chief protagonists in the war, the United States and the Soviet Union, could not have been more different. There's the United States sitting in the middle of North America, oceans on either side of us, protecting us from other continents, a relatively weak nation to the south of us, and the friendliest nation on earth to the north of us. Even the native peoples who were here when the European colonists first started arriving were not that formidable a foe and did not provide that much of an obstacle to expansion. So the United States and the American people were able to expand and develop in a way that cultivated what became our most important word, freedom. Russia/Soviet Union, very, very different. Large landmass surrounded by hostile neighbors with very, very few natural barriers to protect them. Not surprisingly, the most important word in the mentality of the Russian people and the Soviet Union, security. And if you look at the history of Russia and the Soviet Union, you can understand why security became an obsession. Let's go through the list. The Vikings, the end of the Middle Ages, the Mongols from Asia, the Swedes in the 17th century, the French under Napoleon, the Poles for a brief time at the end of World War I, the Germans twice, and yes, even the United States. American troops went into the Soviet Union at the end of World War I in an attempt to support the forces in the Russian Civil War that were fighting against the Bolsheviks. Obviously, we did not succeed. We were only there for a little bit. But you can guarantee that every kid growing up in the Soviet Union learned in their history classes that the United States had invaded their country at one point. Our history is very different. The British invaded during the War of 1812, and then we were safe until almost 200 years later when Al-Qaeda attacked. And you can say, well, what about Pearl Harbor? That's true. I mean, Hawaii was a colony, not a state. But that was not an invasion. The attack on Pearl Harbor, as we discussed, was just to, give them an easier time overrunning the Philippines. Not surprisingly, the Soviet Union adopted a government and economic system which, philosophically at least, theoretically at least, guarantees security. Whereas the United States adopted a economic system called capitalism, a government system called democracy, which both have at their cores, the idea of freedom. And you can't have 100% of both. Every time you try to acquire some more security, you give up some of your freedom. I mean, think of Social Security. You pay taxes into that, and taxes do take away some of your freedom to spend all your money. You want security on airplanes? Well, you got to pay tax money to pay for the FAA. So but we tend to fall down on the side of freedom. And the communist system obviously falls down on the side of security, and there was very little freedom in that type of system, which we regarded obviously as immoral. There were issues that emerged between the two countries as a result of World War II that really had nothing to do with the theories of communism and capitalism. The first was the fact that we took 2.5 years until we invaded northern France on D-Day. Now, we had plenty of reasons for delaying that long, but in the end, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet leadership were convinced that that delay was to weaken the Soviet Union, to force them to do the bulk of the fighting against Nazi Germany, to make them weaker, to make them lose as many troops, many tanks and whatever as possible, so that at the end of the war, we and the British could dominate the post-war world. Look at the difference in those casualty figures. I mean, 400,000 is a lot of Americans who died in World War II, but look at the Soviet Union, 15 to 20 million, somewhere about 10% of their population. And you can imagine, ideology aside, when a nation loses 10% of its population to anything, that they would say to themselves, this will never happen again. And a lot of what the Soviet Union thought that they were doing at the end of World War II was just taking steps to guarantee their security, to guarantee that they would never lose 10 to 20 million of, 9 to 10% of the population, 15 to 20 million of their own people. Then there was the issue of the atomic bomb. We developed it in secret. We shared some of those secrets with Great Britain, our good buddies, but we didn't tell the Soviet Union anything about it. They knew we were doing stuff. They had spies. We didn't consult them when we were making ready to use it on Japan either. And so, again, in the end, Stalin wondered if that weapon was being developed as much to be a threat against his country after the war as it was to end the war. The first test case that led to the Cold War had to do with Eastern Europe. World War II had officially begun on September 1st, 1939, when the Germans invaded Poland. And so the fate of Poland, the post-war fate of Poland, was very important to us. And while the Soviet Union drove the Nazis out of Poland, at the end of the war, they didn't leave. And instead of inviting the Polish government in exile, which had been in London the entire war, to come back and participate in the post-war government, the Soviet Union simply installed a communist system for Poland that obviously would be friendly to the Soviet Union and would mimic much of its political and economic system. And then that became the pattern for the other nations of Eastern Europe that the Soviet army had liberated, including their zone of Germany, which became a separate nation during the Cold War called East Germany. Now, the Soviet Union would have argued that what they were doing in Eastern Europe was not about, conquering other countries and creating an empire. It was about creating a buffer zone, a ring of nations to their west that would serve as a middle ground between the threats that Western Europe might pose to them and their own country. If another war came, another invasion from the West came, that's where most of the invasions of Russia had come from, they would do the fighting in other people's lands, not inside the Soviet Union. Obviously, we didn't accept that interpretation. We thought that what they were doing in Eastern Europe was just step one in their ultimate master plan to take over the world. Well, they came back at us and said, you Americans talk about the freedom of people of Poland and Hungary and all these nations. You've never cared about their freedom before. And the freedom that you are concerned about in these places is not the freedom to vote. It's the freedom to buy your cars and your refrigerators and your radios. That you Americans are just terrified that your economy is going to slip back into another depression since the war is over, and you need new markets and maybe new places to invest in new factories. That is what you're interested in. You're as interested in serving your own interests as we are. So stop being, this glorious defender of democracy of Eastern Europe. You don't care about these people after they buy their cars, okay? Obviously, that's not something that we accepted. We did have a fear that the economy would return to depression, though. In 1946, a man who had been in the embassy staff inside of the Soviet Union wrote an article in a magazine, and he outlined what he believed should be the long-term strategic policy of the United States in the Cold War. And it became known as containment. Okay? And I've highlighted in red the important passages. He said that the Soviet Union is a very patient country, and they're willing to wait a long time to achieve their objectives. And the United States as we know, we've talked about, tend not to be a patient country. We like immediate results. We live in the present, and we're going to have to sort of act out of character and maintain a long-term, and you can see the word vigilant, policy of containing Russian expansion. Okay, but he says in this article, if we do it, then eventually they will begin to fall apart. That the only way that the Soviet or the communist system can survive and thrive is through constant expansion. If you remember, the Southerners in the United States had the same belief about slavery. If it didn't expand, it would die. Well, Kennan is saying the same thing about communism. And so the next year, President Truman unveiled what became the policy of the Cold War, and it's known as the Truman Doctrine, and it put into place this idea of containment. Now, specifically, it had to do with two countries in the Eastern Mediterranean that are each fighting against communist pressure. In Greece, it was a civil war against communist guerrillas. In Turkey, it was actually pressure on the Turkish government from the Soviet Union to allow the Soviet Union to use the water passage between the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea, where the Soviet Union had naval bases. And that would have meant Turkey giving up the sovereignty to some of its waterways, which they didn't want to do. But neither of these countries could defend against this pressure without some military aid. So Truman wanted that military aid from Congress. $400 million doesn't sound like a lot today. Back then it was a lot. And the thing was, we'd never aided countries militarily in peacetime. This was unprecedented. We'd never done this before. And so Truman was told by his advisors if he wants to get that money, he's going to have to go to Congress and make a speech in which he sort of scares people. And that's what he did do. And again, there's an excerpt of what became known as the Truman Doctrine, and talks about two ways of life. One is based on the will of the majority, free institutions. That's us. The other way is based on the will of a minority, terror, oppression. That's those guys. But the key passage is coming up in red. I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. Where? Everywhere in the world. The Truman Doctrine meant that American foreign policy would now look at every single place in the world as vital to its national security. Why did American soldiers find themselves in action in places like Korea and Vietnam? Because of the Truman Doctrine. The next year, our Secretary of State, George Marshall, unveiled a plan to try to help Western Europe rebuild economically. Western Europe was still struggling. 3 years after the war, its economies were struggling, and people inside of countries like France and Italy were beginning to actually elect members of their communist parties to political office. We were afraid that communism might come to Western Europe through elections. And we couldn't say anything about that. That's democracy. Well, what could cause the people to turn away from communist solutions? American financial aid. And the tipping point was when there was a coup in Czechoslovakia in 1948 that overthrew a democratic government and installed a communist dictatorship. And at that point, Congress rushed to appropriate the money. And so over the course of the next 4 years, $12 billion in American resources was pumped into the economies of Western Europe, and it worked. And then the final piece of the puzzle was a military alliance formed in 1949 that would guarantee the backing, the military backing of the United States for all of those blue countries. An attack on one would be regarded as an attack on all.